for me, the fascinating thing about Irish female immigrants into America, in particular, revolves around the Bridgets. These kind of nameless women who worked as maids until maybe they married. And, it was a simple life. It was not a life of glory or fame, but they kept their families, both in Ireland and in America, well fed and sometimes brought out, of course, the chain migration, and they were responsible for building a lot of the churches and the networks that were so integral to the immigrant experience and community in cities across America.
Welcome to Ireland and the Making of America,
a podcast exploring how Ireland and the Irish helped shape the United States, politically, culturally, socially, sometimes in ways that we rarely think about.
I'm Liam Kennedy, Director of the Clinton Institute for American Studies at University College Dublin.
And I'm Scott Lucas, journalist, political analyst, and professor of international politics at the Clinton Institute.
In this episode, we're joined by Elizabeth Stack, a historian, researcher with broad interest in Irish American history. Elizabeth is currently the Education Director for the Celtic Junction Arts Center in Minnesota, and formerly the Executive Director of the Irish American Heritage Museum in Albany.
Elizabeth will help us explore the roles of Irish women in the United States from the mid-19th century all the way to today.
Elizabeth, great to see you. Thank you for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited.
Well, we've certainly talked about women in previous episodes. What does it mean to really focus on the role of Irish women in the making of America? So, Elizabeth, where do we start if we want to tell that story? Where do we begin?
I think, that's one of the things that intrigues me about history, that sometimes, of course, we know the great and the good and the bad and the inglorious, but actually sometimes the story of women is a little bit more hidden. And so for me, the fascinating thing about Irish female immigrants into America, in particular, revolves around the Bridgets. These kind of nameless women who worked as maids until maybe they married. And, it was a simple life. It was not a life of glory or fame, but they kept their families, both in Ireland and in America, well fed and sometimes brought out, of course, the chain migration, and they were responsible for building a lot of the churches and the networks that were so integral to the immigrant experience and community in cities across America. So for me, it's not the famous people that are the most interesting. Sometimes it's the unknown stories of these women who just worked, and kept things going.
Let's start to think about some of those stories and hear them relayed by your good self. But can I first ask you, and maybe there's no clear origin point, this name Bridget, why does it become such a stand-in for so many Irish women of that period? Where does that come from? Do we know the origin?
Well, I think accepted scholarship suggests that it was the nickname, that a lot of them were known by in the popular press. And so there were a lot of caricatures, a lot of kind of even vaudeville shows later on where the Irish girl, I suppose so many of them probably had originally been called Bridget, and it just became a stand-in, nickname for Irish maid. In fact, we see in the later 19th century a lot of Irish women changing their name to, become Delia was very common, or some other kind of names that just to get rid of the Bridget slur,
Right. All right, I wasn't aware of that. I hadn't come across it. And interestingly, I know in recent years when people talk about Irish Bridgets, it's usually with a more positive spin. It's like it's been reclaimed, which is probably a good thing, right?
Yeah. Well, I think, Hasia Diner wrote Aaron's Daughters in America maybe in the 80s. And then Margaret Inch Brennan and Janet Nolan have written amazing books about this. So it's not something, it's becoming more broad, particularly now with the publication last year of Bad Bridgets too, by two Irish historians. And of course, they look at the actual bad Bridgets, women who fell into crime maybe and less salubrious lives. But yeah, it's something that, historians have been working on for 40 years. And I think that reclaiming of the name, is something very positive.
Well, that's a good point. When are we really starting here to talk about Irish women in the United States in significant numbers? Is it part of the famine exodus? And if it is, what's particular to women's migration, would you say, that is, really worth underlining?
Yeah. Well, I suppose probably the women do explode around the time of the famine and a little bit afterwards. We know, that obviously Irish men had been immigrating for decades before that. And of course, it was a huge glut around the time of the Erie Canal. And sometimes women came that time too and worked along the canal route with their husband or partner. But I suppose what is unusual in terms of Irish immigration is that the women often come on their own, as do the boys, so women as young as kind of 14 or 15 coming out on their own. Now, maybe people from the village would have come, but this is very different, we'll say, from like the German pattern, which is the family would come, or the Italian pattern where a man would come and in fact come and go. They were called words of passage in the Italian immigrant experience because the man would often go home. He might marry in Italy and, maybe eventually bring the wife and children over to America, or he would retire to Italy. The repatriation rate was much higher for Italians, whereas Irish and Jewish immigration, it's 2 and 3%. And so we don't come home usually. Which is, kind of sad, you could argue, in one element, although we have some knowledge of a couple of women who do come home because they made their fortune as maids and, it increased their experiences at home, their opportunities at home. So there was, Singh, has talked about meeting two sisters on the train near Dingle. And the one girl had been in America and she was very outspoken and dressed kind of modern, and fashionably. And the sister was barefoot and had the blanket over her head, And the girl who was back from America was going to go back because she couldn't handle life in a small town again.
I can see those differences then are really important. What are the drivers then for these Irish women going on their own? I mean, that's quite something in that time period. I suppose one can say, well, poverty and opportunity, but can we be more particular than that? What's driving them?
Yeah, I sometimes think that that's the element we miss as historians. There's always this kind of attitude about that it's a push or just a pull factor. And actually, I think a lot of the women must have been excited about the idea, particularly later on as we get those chain migrants. And so, they're joining an aunt or an older cousin or an older sister or brother. And, life sounds more exciting. When you think about the rural depopulation that happened, especially, in the 19th century, it must have been, their chances were fairly limited given the societal structure here at home, so if they didn't have a dowry or if they weren't educated, what were their options, and so it sounded a lot more attractive, I'm sure, to a lot of these girls that if they went abroad and worked for a while and then they could marry, someone from outside of the parish or maybe outside of even the Irish ethnicity, as we know, a lot of them did marry Chinese men, for instance, downtown in New York, So I think women were more open, actually, and more desiring of opportunity than we kind of have previously thought, that it wasn't just that they were pushed, and there was an agency to it and they made a choice to go.
Right. So if we take them now into the United States, what's settlement like for them? What are the kind of challenges? What's life like for these women who are settling into the United States?
It must have been particularly difficult, I think, in the early 19th century or the mid 19th century. We know that immigrants in the likes of New York and Boston, are settling in slums like 5 Points. Now, Tyler Anbinder has done amazing work recently on the 5 Points area, for example, to say that, these women and men all have bank accounts. They're a lot more kind of socially secure. And that's actually the difference, I think, for any of the immigrant experience among the Irish community. If they go to somebody that they already know, whether it's, someone from their townland, their chances of surviving and thriving are much higher than if they're the first people out, And so I think those bonds of community and kind of fraternity and sorority are much more important than we had previously understood, but they're much more effective than we had previously understood. And so these girls, often they're assigned a job. We know that Grace Smith O'Brien set up almost an agency, to kind of keep them in the harbour area of New York and keep them safe, because there is a lot of recruitment into brothels and into crime and things like that, where maybe they're tricked, sometimes into working in a brothel, without realising it, and then they owe money. And so the maids, are very well informed by the end of kind of a session. They trade information on employers. They are upwardly mobile. They know, to get better jobs and better paid jobs. And they upskill quite quickly. So I think there's much more, again, as I say, like a organization to it than we had previously thought, maybe.
Okay, so you said maids. Would that have been the predominant employment opportunity?
Yeah, particularly for that first generation, they're not skilled. And I mean, this is one of the things in those caricatures, and you've probably seen them in, Harper's Bazaar and those kinds of magazines, that they can't cook, they don't understand the lingo. But it's surprising how quickly they move into, knowing how to do it. And again, like swapping jobs for better conditions. Now, the kind of caricatures follow them right into the 1870s and 1880s. And the lady who wrote Little Women, Louisa May Alcott, writes this broadside against Irish Bridgets in the 1870s, I think, about how kind of uppity they are and that they're not obedient. But I think they, within a generation then, their daughters, are qualifying as teachers. And so there's massive ambition among the women. Now, you could argue, maybe because a maid would see like American mores at play in these middle class and upper middle class homes. So they're kind of maybe easier to integrate into American society. She's taking home these lessons. She's kind of teaching her daughter. Whereas the men we know are often working in, blue collar jobs, surrounded by other men, particularly maybe other Irishmen if they're in sanitation, or later on the police and the firemen. And so that's kind of a different culture, almost maybe a more rowdy and masculine culture. So I think the girls in one way are being trained by their moms for this new world in a way that the boys are not. And so I think it allows them, to move up the ranks quicker.
That's fascinating. I wasn't aware of that. And how, as an historian, do you get access to that kind of knowledge and information? As you said yourself, much of this is about people who are unknown, but clearly you're able to develop this understanding of what was going on, right?
Yeah, well, again, building on the knowledge that women like Hassia Diner and Margaret Lynch Brennan and Janet Nolan, Ourselves Alone, these books are fascinating. But there are records about, the teaching unions and membership in the union. And so we can see, that the second generation, or the generation born in America, have more opportunities than their mom before them had. And I think it's credible, to put it down to, of course, they're having education that the mom might not have had in Ireland, but there is something else going on too to allow this ambition, to flourish. And so I think it must be that the mother has seen middle class housing and how it all works, the lace curtains and tablecloths and table manners. And this plays out in popular culture too. You can see it in some of the plays and in some of the ads, even, those caricatures and cartoons, that there's a kind of notions, as we would say at home, that people have notions about themselves. And so even in famous cartoon strips like Jiggs and Maggie, Jiggs is very happy to stay downtown in the slum and to drink the beer. And it's the wife that has these pretensions, and dresses not always very successfully because, of course, she doesn't have the bearing, to carry it off. But her daughter is very well drawn, and she's very, graceful. Now, of course, she marries a Duke o' Nothing or something, I think he's called. Like, she falls for a fella that isn't as wealthy as he, portrays himself. But she would pass in this society in a way that the mother and father don't.
I'm assuming that when we talk about the Bridges, we're generally talking about that wave of immigration that was largely Catholic in the 19th century. I'm wondering about women in Scots-Irish communities, that earlier wave of immigration, and how we begin to frame their negotiation of life in America.
Yeah, I think the earlier immigrants would have come in family groups. So to me, I think most of them are not working outside of the home, or if they are, it's all, it's along the Erie Canal, or it's along whatever project that they're doing. The maids tend to be single women, younger women, and as you say, mostly Catholic. And of course, they stop working once they marry. So, and this is a problem in the culture. I remember seeing in the archives of the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick, an older woman had not married and she had stayed working for a family, she was into her 60s now. The family kind of didn't want her anymore. There was no retirement plan, And so the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick were talking about repatriating her to Roscommon. You think this woman has gone from Roscommon for 50 years. Like, who is even left there to mind her? But she's too physically decrepit to mind herself, And so I think those earlier Scotch-Irish women, there was a lot of, particularly in the early, we'll say the 18th century, lots of chores in the home, like they're baking, they're brewing, they're doing cottage industry, but they're not particularly working outside of the home.
So if we go back to the Irish predominantly Catholic example that you've talked about, the maids, but the maids in a really interesting ways already looking ahead, talking to their daughters about what's possible. The daughters now becoming both more educated and more assimilable in certain ways. Before we talk about what the daughters do in terms of employment opportunities, this pattern, is it distinctive to the Irish at that time in terms of the role of women? Are women moving as quickly ahead in the other ethnic groups at that time?
Yes, I suppose is the answer in broad categories. Like, we do see that there's often like Swedish or Norwegian women also working space, nowhere near the numbers that the Irish are. And oddly, or maybe not so odd given the history, African-American women, for instance, don't want jobs as maids in the North. They might take in laundry to their own home or do that kind of thing. But what sets the Irish apart, because a lot of the Italian and Jewish girls do work in factories. Now, this is sometimes because the family do, or the sweatshops, which are not necessarily factories, but, tenement buildings that have been taken over by maybe as many as 16 or 20 workers. So it appears that the family structure with an Italian or a Jewish, maybe even a German community is a little bit stricter. The girls are more supervised, so they're working in the factory with their brothers or with their fathers. They're not allowed, work outside of the home. But as I say, the Irish girl came on her own. And so that has pluses and minuses. The mayor or the nun of Kinmare wrote an advice book, for girls in the 1830s, talking about, how to keep themselves safe. You think about it like you're maybe at the hands of the master of the house or the younger son in the house. Can you lock the door in the attic? Are you in a dormitory situation? And so, or are they flattered, by the son? And so there are dangers to these girls because of the lack of supervision, which is why the community becomes so important. And so, making sure that they get time off for mass, for instance, and meeting people in the sodalities, it keeps an eye on them and makes sure that they are okay, But because they're on their own, there isn't the supervision, and so they can find their own jobs, And of course, you don't have to pay rent when you're living in as a maid, so you have more money to save and to send home. And this becomes really important, for those girls that don't work, in factories.
So those girls, as you say, don't work in factories, and we're really moving into the next generation now, the daughters, as you call them. What kind of employment are they moving into? I recall many years ago reading that the numbers who move into teaching are really quite extraordinary.
By the late 19th century and early 20th century, it's huge amounts. I think something like 70% of public school teachers in cities like Chicago and New York, in the early 20th century are Irish. Now, of course, there is an interim period where some of the girls do work in factories. So you've got, particularly in a city like Troy, highly industrialized Troy, New York, they're all working in collar factories and kind of steam laundries and things. But what we notice with the Irish in factories is their involvement in the unions, and so I think that even that kind of is a unique element, in one way, because the early unions, of course, were heavily male biased. But somebody like Mother Jones, gets involved in the 1860s, or what's the name of the girl up in Troy? We've no picture of her, but she was a contemporary, of Kate Mullaney. And, so these women become very involved. Leonora O'Reilly, all of them have had stints in factories, and that's what kind of inputs or gives them the impetus to advocate for workers' rights, because the conditions are so horrific.
This, I think, is a particularly fascinating area of the role of Irish women, is the incredible footprint they have within the labor movement. Can you tell us a bit more about why they're so significant, as well as maybe a little bit more about some of the people who had those roles?
I think the first woman who kind of gets involved is Mother Jones, Mary Harris, born in Cork, of course, and famously called the most dangerous woman in America. And she looks like Mrs. Claus. She's very unassuming, and she was a very clever woman. She aged herself on purpose to, she lied about her birth date and pretended she was older than she was. But she would have left Ireland during the Great Hunger with her parents and siblings, and they all died not long after landing in America. And then she married another, I think they came down through Canada, but she married another man and lost 4 children and her husband to yellow fever in Memphis, I think, where they were living. So she has to start over again, grief-ridden, and moved to Chicago. And she had a dressmaking business, and she wrote that it was, the dichotomy of working in these mansions and watching the maid in the house or the poor people on the street outside the house, really kind of didn't sit well with her. And then she had her own house, which burnt down in the Chicago fire of 1871. So that was when she became involved with the Knights of Labour, and this kind of sense of solidarity. Of course, the railroad strikes were happening around now, the Haymarket affair, and they really radicalized her. And she was lucky too, I suppose, that Terence Powderly, was open to women joining the ranks and all of that. So she becomes massively involved in what she calls her boys, the mine workers, and sets up the United Mine Workers, like all through Appalachia, and she's just absolutely fearless. She gives speeches. She understands the power of the press, and PR in a way that maybe others kind of hadn't. And again, because I think she's this little old lady and very unassuming, it's almost unbelievable, like that she would be that feared by the mine owners or the National Guard or whoever they're, the Pinkertons, where they have, faced Irish strikers before, famously the Molly Maguires and things. But this little old lady is just able to kind of get past, and then of course she looks after the children too. She has a famous campaign, the March of the Mill Children, because there are no labour laws, and so children are working 6 days a week, some of them as young as 6 and 7, because their little fingers can get into the machinery. And so she takes all of these children who've been mutilated and lost hands and fingers and marches to New York from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And so, she just is iconic and not relenting, and uses the exhibits like of these terrible children, who hold banners that say, "We want to go to school," very, very able to kind of tug at your heartstring. So she gets involved with the Wobblies, too, the Industrial Workers of the World, in 1905. They're very, very progressive women. And so the Wobblies in particular, too, don't organize, horizontally. It's vertically. It's every skill level, every race, the genders, national origin doesn't matter. And so, they want to abolish the capitalism and the system, so that the means of production will be controlled by the working class. So she features, prominently in strikes, again, around the country. She gets involved in campaigns as far across, as San Francisco. And then when she dies, she has a huge funeral. Now, you could argue kind of that the union movement is at its zenith, I suppose, in the 20th century, around the rebuilding after the Great Depression and stuff. But she helped to get it there, and to give workers a voice.
It's a remarkable story.
Someone
who, we're interested in Ireland, the making of America, and one of the most iconic figures in that has to be Mother Jones. There's no question about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and still one of the press, over there, kind of an independent press is called Mother Jones, because of her. So she's had this huge, impact.
So there's a legacy as well. But you did talk about the unknown women. So, Mother Jones, yes, some people will know the name. They'll know much more now, given what you've said. But is there anything you want to add about, those other women who are out there, maybe, less well known today because they're active in so many of the union elements, right?
I think to the nuns, like not all of them are known. There are a couple of very famous ones, but Sister Irene Fitzgibbon famously sets up the Foundling Home in New York, which throws out the old playbook. Mothers are allowed to stay if they want to and keep their baby, but also if you can donate the baby anonymously. And so the shame attached to, unmarried pregnancy, isn't there in her model. She also sets up what becomes the modern foster care system. Now she is involved in one of the early orphan trains where they kind of ship kids out. And some of these children, of course, aren't really adopted. They're just being indentured, which is unfortunate. But I think her meaning was good. And certainly, for Catholics in the 19th century, like, they were facing a lot of prejudice, and we underestimate that, I think, actually. How anti-Catholic. There were burnings, for instance, like of churches in Boston and Philadelphia in the 1840s and 50s, and a lot of kind of negative press right the way through, particularly around, the use of the Bible in state schools and things. So for, a woman like her to set up a convent and an orphanage, as I say, and a hospital too, very significant for the community. Another woman who did more, she wasn't just Irish, or involved with the Irish, but Sister Anthony, a Limerick woman who was foundational in the nursing orders that were involved in the Civil War. And even like Abraham Lincoln acknowledged, the Irish nuns on the field, angels of the battlefield, as they were called. But she came up with a very early system of triage because things were so tight, on the battlefield, that she would kind of organize the patients into who needed assistance, who needed operating immediately, or, who just leave to die, sort of thing. And so the triage system as we know it today came from her work,
Yeah.
So, I think, like these women who built families and who sustained the culture, it's when you look at modern, Irish America today, the amount of kids, for instance, learning Irish dance or songs, that kind of stuff, it is the family unit like that kept that tradition, those traditions alive. And so I suppose that's another element of the domesticity, of transmitting a culture, how much of it happens at home, because the parents won't forget it,
Yeah. So that takes us, I suppose, into the 20th century very much. And you've given us a very strong sense of how Irish women have been part of, I suppose, the assimilation process. So when we get into that later part of the 20th century, can we still talk about patterns of employment, or is it more the case now they're more fully assimilated and it's less difficult to detect the role of those Irish women? What would you say?
Well, it's interesting, we have had, I suppose because I'm working on the project too, I'm always conscious of the Irishness of the woman. But when you look at, modern CEOs like Maggie Timoney, from Heineken, and we've had some very good publishers like, Carmel Snow and a few other women, of course, Patricia Harty in Irish America. I don't know how much of their Irishness was important to them, or in helping them get there. Certainly, I think for American-born women of Irish descent, like a lot of them do seem to be very conscious of their roots and very proud of their roots. But I think, the opportunities were given to them because of their education, Now, they might have grown up in a parochial school system, so it's interesting to see, does it all kind of play in, I'm not sure. But I think the 20th century, there seems to be kind of a lag in the middle of the 20th century in terms of ethnic awareness. I've always been fascinated by it, that right up kind of until maybe the Great Depression, people were very consciously Irish American. And then, the Great Depression happens, World War II happens, the GI Bill happens. It allows a lot of Irish Americans, to, we'll say, move out of Queens and into Long Island or similar situations in Chicago and Boston. And then all of a sudden, around the time that Kennedy is president, everyone is claiming their Irishness again. So, I'm not sure, what happened in that kind of 30 or 40 year break where people of any ethnicity, like it didn't really matter. Now, I say that it really might be because of the war too. Like, I'm sure, I know that the German American community, like after World War I and again, of course, World War II, although it really had already happened by the end of World War I, a lot of German Americans changed their names. A lot of the cultural stuff, like German Americans had been amazing at, preserving their language, for instance, and there were Turnverein and singing societies and all kinds of things, very thriving German language press. And all of that, kind of melts away a little bit after World War One. So maybe that has an effect on the other immigrant groups too, yeah, that it is just easier to be American, and to say, and I'm sure maybe, Irish Americans saw it as proof that they had arrived if you could assimilate, and we start to see Catholics marrying across, so Italian and German, even though even as late as the 1950s, it was kind of, past remarkable that somebody married outside of their ethnicity. But yet at the same time, the parish structure was less ethnically focused, and just because of movement and, this rush to the suburbs. So I suppose there's a lot of tension in America too around, race in the 1950s and 60s. And so maybe it was easier for ethnic groups to just coalesce, around an American identity. But that certainly is fired up again, as I say, when Kennedy was elected.
Elizabeth, in passing there, you mentioned your project, and that's something we should come back to and state more clearly. So can you tell us about the project you're involved with here?
Mm-hmm. So I'm working with the people out of Washington, D.C. on Irish America 250, and I'm specifically looking at women that we can kind of, claim as having contributed in some way, to the past 250 years of American history. So it's interesting, because as a historian, of course, you're used to working with dead people, and it's more firmly in the past, and you can, use your sources. So it's been tricky for me, trying to navigate this, talking, as we said, about Maggie Timoney or Patricia Harty or Loretta Brennan Buxman. How do you handle modern living women, in this look back at American women? So it's been interesting, to notice the change and the differences between us. If you're dealing with somebody from 150 years ago, everything that we can know is knowable, and so trying to get the balance right, has been challenging for me as a historian, but very interesting to look at. We've talked about it again already, like how important is their ethnicity if they're modern Americans, and so I'm grappling with that at the moment.
That's a big question, though, and we've grappled a bit too, because it seems that with almost every episode that we do, no matter what the topic, in terms of the period we cover, we get this very sort of rich environmental sense of Irishness from the mid-19th century forward. And then somewhere in the 20th century, we start to talk about this waning or falling away and assimilation. And then it becomes interesting to see what happens after. And that's difficult. That's where we are today. But one of the things you said struck me as interesting. It's a question of, well, how important is their ethnicity to them? Do you tend to find that it is very significant? How do people, in this case, women, how do they articulate that importance?
Yeah, well, it does appear to be. Now, of course, they're going to be biased when talking to somebody like me about it, for Irish America. And so, I wonder if they were giving the same interview, to I don't know, The Economist, would it come up at all? You know what I mean? But I will say most of them that I've certainly been dealing with, are very conscious of their Irishness, whether it's sometimes expressed through their faith, and that's something that, I suppose I have to grapple with too. I've lived in America for 18 years, and Catholic is not one of the top 3 descriptors of myself that I would give, an Irish Catholic is not a thing. We're all Roman Catholic, and so it's interesting to me, like what parts of the identity have been stressed. And so, I would say, I suppose there are people who are 4 or 5 generations out. They have no link with the home country, except through maybe Catholicism or through shared remembered stories from earlier generations. And then there's people who, their grandmother moved to America and she had a brogue all of her life, and they remember that. And so maybe the food is kind of central to it, or these Irish dancing classes. So it's, I think even people that have just a kind of a token nod to their culture are conscious of it,
So, Elizabeth, in thinking about these multiple roles that Irish women have had and how we move into a form of assimilation, do these women, either through stereotype or through really positive representation, become well known in popular culture roles, whether that's cinema or later television or whatever it might be?
Yeah, I think the portrayal of Irish women is quite funny. From the start in those caricatures, which of course were less than flattering in one way, there is this sense that Irish women can be very opinionated and independent. And yet at the same time, there's other kind of received wisdom that said, they're very obedient because of their Catholicism, and so they can be quite like clannish and afraid to rock the boat. So you think of somebody like Maureen O'Hara, in the mid 20th century, like, who kind of encapsulates all of that, the red-haired, fiery, kind of temper, which is a very different portrayal from the men in cinema. Like Irish men tend to be Irish American, cops or priests, and there's several examples, of those that are very, very famous. But like Barbara Stanwyck had Irish ancestry, and I think played, I can't remember, was it in June on the Paycock, or she was in some filmed famous, Irish play. But I suppose Maureen O'Hara is kind of the standard for the 20th century, which, when you look at it, is maybe only one step removed from those caricatures of the maid, shaking her fist and kind of refusing to bow down to the lovely wasp maiden in the corner, But of course, Maureen O'Hara was very confident in her Irishness, and always spoke about it, and confident too in her ability to stand up to, characters like John Ford or John Wayne, and hold her own. So she was very self-consciously, I think, playing to that image too of a strong, Irish woman. I suppose the other one that really kind of didn't follow to America is the one that we have here, the Kathleen Ní Houlihan, and kind of the beating of the chest and the poor victim that needs to be, preserved. Like, it's funny that there are riots in New York too, around Playboy and things, in the early 19th century. And there's a hilarious story I think it's from around 1907, might be a little bit later. There was a very famous vaudeville act by the Russell brothers. They were a group from Limerick who were like massively popular in America, and all of a sudden they dressed as maids, and the humor was kind of a little bit bawdy but not too much, and of course they would portray the maids as maybe a little bit foolish. And one of the things was, she would the maid would come into the room not dressed properly, and carrying a salad, and the master of the house says, "Oh my God, Bridget, what are you doing?" She said, "Well, you told me to serve the salad undressed," and so little silly things, a society springs up. I can't remember, it has a massively long name, but something like, the Society to Stop the Propagation of Bad Influences Against Irish, Women. It's something crazy. And they egg the players in a theatre in Brooklyn and threaten with, even worse kind of, if should they go on stage in the city. And their act dies overnight because how dare you impugn Irish womanhood,
Right. Okay. So we've come a long way from these early stereotypes that you're talking about. But as you say, you're still finding that in talking to Irish women, you're finding ethnicity here can be very significant. It ranges and varies, but it can have a lot of significance. When you look back now, and you're an historian, and also an historian with a real sense of bringing history to the public. What is it that you think we can learn that's most valuable about the role of Irish women now in this year of America 250, when we really are thinking about, where is America today? How has it developed? If we try and summarize the role of Irish women in that, what might you say?
Well, I suppose even looking at the voiceless and nameless Bridgets, I think the lesson that I've learned from Irish women in America is the communalism. So even these Bridgets, who didn't have a union, or who weren't even given their own name, the dignity of their own name, oftentimes they do share information, and there's famous sketches in, the early Irish papers of them sending money home or swapping information at the immigrant bank, for instance, about where they can, where's a good house to work, that kind of thing. So I think that's for me the lesson of the Irish. They set up convents, which again are communal. It's about education, it's about giving back to the community. The same thing with all of the union leaders like Leonora O'Reilly, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, so many of them, Inez Milholland. There was and some of these women didn't care about suffrage, for instance. It's not like they were progressive across the board. Mother Jones thought it didn't matter whether you could vote or not, like, unless you were getting paid properly, and so it's interesting to me that there is that huge desire for uplift of everyone in the community, and particularly when you think about the 19th century, hard scrapping going on for jobs, particularly, among the men, like the fire brigade. our fire department isn't professionalized until the 1860s. You know, they've had a hard scrap in the war, these Irish men in the Civil War. And so the fact that women are thinking about, you know, solidarity and communalism and pensions and holidays and conditions of work, you know, I think is very, very telling. And so that is something that I think we contributed massively, the Irish Americans contributed massively to across the board for 60 or 70 years, you know. And so when you look at the celebrations of America 250 today, I think, you know, we're in danger maybe of losing a lot of that progress that had been made. Like the income disparity gap is bigger maybe now than it was during the Gilded Age, which was at the height of these movements, you know, in terms of strikes. And so we've probably backslid a little bit. You know, the Irish were always great at getting involved. Even the politicians, you know, to start as a district leader or an assembly member and work your way up. You know, the saloon being so important in those early years, like for sharing information and that's where they voted, you know, was in the pubs, which is kind of tricky. I don't think we should do that today, for instance. But, you know, there is, I think, a huge, I don't know if I thought we would be looking at this in 2026, you know, the way, or through the prism that we are currently, you know.
Those are great comments to come to a close with in reference to America 250, I think. But the one last thing I'd ask of you is just to tell us, for the sake of all of us, our listeners and our viewers, where can we access your project on Irish Women in America 250?
So yes, we have a whole website, Irish America 250, which we're revamping and rejigging. We've launched a new campaign actually to solicit people's stories, you know, so a 2 or 3 minute long video about myself, you know, as I say, I moved to America in 2009. You know, what brought me there. I didn't have really family or, you know, anything over there. And so that's, yeah, the Irish America 250 website and social media campaign is ongoing and will be for the rest of the year. And we welcome, you know, everyone to share their story with us as well as read the stories that we'll have. I think we're hoping to launch the women's project specifically in September. So, yeah, ...
Elizabeth, thank you. We'll all look out for that. But for now, thanks so much for joining us to talk about Ireland and the making of America.
Great. Thank you for having me. It was very enjoyable.
That's all for this episode of Ireland and the Making of America.
Thanks to Elizabeth Stack for joining and sharing her insights on Irish women's experience in America.
You can follow this series on all your favorite podcast platforms: Apple, Spotify, YouTube. You can follow Liam Kennedy and the Clinton Institute on Instagram, on Facebook, and on YouTube. You can follow Scott Lucas Worldview on YouTube and on Instagram as well.
And if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, share, leave a review.
We'll be back next week with another conversation on Ireland and the making of America.
Until next time, this podcast was brought to you by the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin, and produced with thanks by Michelle May.